The town of Briarcliff was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. Perched on the rugged coast of Maine, it was a small, sleepy settlement where the wind carried the scent of salt and pine, and the ocean's roar was a constant companion. The town's history was steeped in mystery, with tales of shipwrecks, lost treasures, and ghostly apparitions passed down through generations. At the heart of this enigmatic town stood the old lighthouse, a towering sentinel on the cliff's edge, its weathered stones bearing silent witness to centuries of storms and secrets. Jake O'Connor had arrived in Briarcliff a month earlier, driven by his fascination with history and a particular interest in the untold stories of America's coastal towns. At 25, Jake was a young historian, fresh out of graduate school, with a passion for uncovering the past. His dark hair was always a bit tousled, and his glasses gave him an air of scholarly determination. He had quickly become a regular at the town's small library, poring over dusty volumes and yellowed documents that held fragments of Briarcliff's history. It was on one such day, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the library's tall windows, that Jake stumbled upon something extraordinary. Tucked between the pages of an old leather-bound book was a folded piece of parchment, its edges frayed and its surface covered in faded ink. Jake's heart raced as he carefully unfolded the paper. It was a map, hand-drawn and ancient, with cryptic symbols and notations in a script he recognized as 18th century English. The map seemed to depict the coastline around Briarcliff, with the lighthouse prominently marked. But what caught Jake's attention was a small, red X near the base of the cliffs, accompanied by a note in the margin. "Here lies the fortune of Captain Blackwell, hidden from the eyes of men." Jake's hands trembled with excitement. Captain Blackwell was a notorious pirate, rumored to have terrorized the Atlantic coast in the 1700s. Legends of his hidden treasure had circulated for years, but no one had ever found a trace of it. Jake knew he couldn't keep this discovery to himself. He had become friends with Megan Thompson, a 24-year-old artist who had lived in Briarcliff her entire life. Megan's art was a reflection of the town's rugged beauty and its mysterious past. Her canvases often depicted stormy seas, ancient trees in the lighthouse, bathed in the golden light of dusk. She was a free spirit, with long auburn hair that seemed to have a life of its own, and a quick smile that could brighten even the gloomiest of days. Jake found Megan in her studio, a converted boathouse that overlooked the harbor. The walls were covered in paintings, each telling a story of the town's heritage. Megan was working on a new piece when Jake burst in, holding the map like a prized artifact. "Megan, you won't believe what I've found," Jake exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement. Megan looked up, curious. "What is it, Jake?" He handed her the map, watching as her eyes widened with amazement. "I found this in the library. It's a map that could lead to Captain Blackwell's treasure. And look, it points to somewhere near the lighthouse." Megan's artistic mind immediately began to whirl with possibilities. "This is incredible, Jake. Imagine if we could find the treasure. It would be the discovery of a lifetime, and think of the inspiration it could bring for my art." However, their excitement was soon tempered by the arrival of Tom, Megan's older brother. Tom was a fisherman, a man of the sea, with weathered skin and hands that bore the marks of years spent hauling nets and steering boats through rough waters. At 28, he was fiercely protective of his sister and had little patience for the town's old legends. "What are you two up to now?" Tom asked, his voice tinged with skepticism, as he walked into the studio, his boots clunking against the wooden floor. Jake and Megan quickly explained their discovery, their enthusiasm spilling over as they described the map and the possibility of finding Captain Blackwell's treasure. But Tom's expression remained serious. "Megan, you know those cliffs are dangerous," Tom said, his tone firm. "People have lost their lives trying to climb down there. And as for the treasure, it's probably just another tall tale, like all the others around here. Those legends have a way of leading to nothing but trouble." Megan frowned, not wanting to be discouraged. "But Tom, what if it's real? We could be the first to find it." "And Jake's right, this map looks authentic." Tom sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "I get it, I do. But I've seen enough of the sea's fury to know when something's not worth the risk. If you're really set on this, then at least promise me you'll be careful. And don't go without me. Someone needs to make sure you two don't end up in over your heads." Jake nodded, appreciating Tom's concern, even if it tempered his excitement. "We'll be careful, Tom, and we wouldn't dream of going without you." Megan smiled, reassured by her brother's protective nature. "Okay, big brother. We'll do this together. Who knows? Maybe you'll end up believing in a little bit of legend after all." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lighthouse in a silhouette against the darkening sky, the three of them stood together, looking out at the cliffs that held the secrets of the past. Little did they know that their adventure would take them far beyond the search for treasure, into the very heart of Briarcliff's most haunting mysteries. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale glow on the cliffs beneath the old lighthouse. The air was crisp and tinged with the scent of salt and seaweed, carried by the wind that whistled through the rugged terrain. The ocean, restless and powerful, crashed violently against the rocks below, sending up plumes of spray that shimmered in the morning light. Jake, Megan, and Tom stood at the edge of the cliff, peering down at the sheer drop that awaited them. The map Jake had discovered showed a path leading down the side of the cliffs, but the reality of the descent was far more daunting than any of them had imagined. The rocks were jagged and slippery, worn smooth by years of relentless waves. The narrow ledges offered little in the way of security, and the slightest misstep could send them plunging into the churning waters below. "Are you sure about this?" Tom asked, his voice low and serious as he scanned the treacherous path ahead. His concern was palpable, and his protective instincts were on high alert. Jake nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'm sure, Tom. This map is the real deal. I can feel it. We're so close to uncovering something incredible. We just have to be careful and take it slow." Megan, standing beside Jake with her auburn hair blowing wildly in the wind, looked out at the cliffs with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Her artist's eye couldn't help but marvel at the raw beauty of the landscape, the way the sunlight played off the wet rocks, creating a kaleidoscope of colors. She knew this adventure could be dangerous, but the thrill of discovery and the chance to capture something truly unique in her art drove her forward. "I'm ready," Megan said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "Let's do this." Tom sighed, knowing there was no talking them out of it now. He adjusted the straps of the backpack he carried, which was filled with ropes, harnesses, and other climbing gear. If they were going to do this, they would do it right, with every precaution in place. "Okay then," Tom said, taking the lead. "Follow my steps exactly. We stick together, and if anything feels off, we turn back. Got it?" "Got it," Jake and Megan replied in unison. Tom began the descent, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had spent his life navigating the unforgiving coast. His boots found purchase on the narrow ledges, and his hands gripped the rocks with a steady strength. Jake followed closely behind, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Megan came last, her breath catching in her throat, each time she glanced down at the swirling waters below. The first few minutes of the climb were tense, every step requiring careful calculation. The cliffs were as dangerous as they looked, with loose rocks occasionally giving way underfoot. Tom's steady presence was a comfort to Jake and Megan, his calm instructions helping them stay focused. As they descended further, the roar of the ocean grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. The waves seemed to reach up towards them, crashing against the rocks with a force that sent vibrations through the cliffs. The air was thick with moisture, and the scent of salt became almost overwhelming. Jake's mind raced as they moved lower, his thoughts consumed by the possibilities that awaited them. If the map was correct, they were on the verge of discovering something that had remained hidden for centuries. The idea that they might uncover Captain Blackwell's treasure, a legendary hoard that had eluded treasure hunters for generations, filled him with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. Megan, too, was captivated by the moment. Each step brought them closer to a new perspective on the world around them, one that she longed to capture in her paintings. The cliffs, with their jagged edges and weathered surfaces, were a living canvas, and the adventure itself was a story she could tell through her art. But as they continued their descent, the landscape became more unforgiving. The ledges grew narrower and the rocks more treacherous. At one point, Megan slipped, her foot skidding on a patch of moss. She gasped, her hands scrambling for a hold. But Tom was quick to react, grabbing her arm and steadying her before she could fall. "Careful, Megan," Tom warned, his voice edged with concern. "These cliffs don't care about our plans. We have to respect them, or we'll pay the price. Thanks, Tom, Megan said, her voice shaky. She took a deep breath, refocusing herself. I'll be more careful. They pressed on, each step more challenging than the last. The cliffs seemed to close in around them, the once beautiful landscape now a maze of danger. The closer they got to the bottom, the more isolated they felt from the world above. The lighthouse, once visible as a guiding beacon, was now obscured by the cliffs, leaving them alone with the sea and the rocks. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a small, narrow ledge that extended outward from the cliff face. It was here that the map indicated they should find something. An entrance, a marker, something that would guide them to the treasure. But all they saw was a wall of rock, damp with seawater and slick to the touch. Jake's brow furrowed as he studied the map, then the cliff before him. This should be the spot, he muttered, more to himself than to the others. But where? Megan looked around, searching for any sign that they were in the right place. Maybe it's hidden, she suggested. Or we're missing something. Tom, ever the pragmatist, started feeling along the rock wall with his hands, searching for anything unusual. It's got to be here, he said, though his voice held a note of doubt. But if we don't find something soon, we might need to rethink this. Jake refused to give up. He crouched down, examining the base of the cliff, running his fingers along the rocks. And then, just as he was about to lose hope, his hand brushed against something. A small metal ring, rusted and nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding stone. Here, Jake exclaimed, his voice filled with triumph. He tugged at the ring, and with a creaking groan, a hidden door in the rock slowly swung open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway leading into the cliff. Megan's eyes widened with amazement. "We did it," she whispered, her heart pounding with excitement. Tom, ever cautious, peered into the darkness. "Looks like we found our entrance," he said, "but we don't know what's waiting inside. We need to be careful. Who knows how stable it is after all these years?" Jake nodded, his excitement tempered by Tom's words. "You're right. But we've come this far. We can't turn back now." Together they gathered their gear and prepared to enter the passageway, their minds racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. The cliffs had tested them, but they had proven themselves equal to the challenge. Now, as they stood on the threshold of the unknown, they knew that their adventure was only just beginning. The passageway was narrow and cold, the walls slick with moisture and encrusted with salt. The dim light from their flashlights flickered off the wet stone, casting long shadows that danced eerily in the confined space. The sound of the ocean, once a distant roar, now echoed through the tunnel, a constant reminder of the untamed forces outside. Jake, Megan, and Tom moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing softly in the darkness. As they ventured deeper into the passage, the air grew colder, and the scent of the sea became stronger, mingling with the musty odor of decay. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them ever downward until they finally reached a wider chamber. A hidden cave halfway down the cliffs, just as the map had indicated. Jake stepped into the cave first, his flashlight sweeping across the walls. The space was larger than he had anticipated, with a high, uneven ceiling that dripped with condensation. The floor was uneven, littered with debris that had washed in over the years. Fragments of wood, bits of rusted metal, and tattered scraps of cloth. The sound of the ocean was louder here, reverberating through the stone and creating a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth itself. "This is it," Jake whispered, more to himself than to the others. His voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the cavernous space. "This has to be the place." Megan followed him in, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the surroundings. The walls of the cave were lined with shelves carved directly into the rock, and on those shelves sat remnants of a long-forgotten past. Old wooden crates, their surfaces warped and splintered by time, and a large rusted chest, its hinges corroded and its lid slightly ajar. "This is incredible," Megan murmured, moving closer to one of the crates. She ran her fingers lightly over the rough wood, marveling at how something so old could still exist, hidden away from the world for so long. "It's like stepping back in time." Tom, ever cautious, kept his flashlight trained on the entrance. "We need to be quick," he warned, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "This place doesn't look stable. We don't want to be caught in here if something goes wrong." Jake nodded, but his curiosity got the better of him. He knelt beside the chest, carefully lifting the lid to peer inside. The contents were mostly decayed, rotting fabric, tarnished metal trinkets, and a few coins that had long since lost their luster. But among the debris, something caught his eye. A small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn but still intact. "What's this?" Jake muttered, reaching in to retrieve the journal. As he held it up to the light, he could see that the pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. He opened it carefully, his heart racing as he scanned the first few entries. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and unmistakably old. "It's a journal," Jake said, his voice filled with excitement. "It looks like it belonged to someone connected to the lighthouse, maybe the keeper or even one of the pirates." Megan moved closer, peering over Jake's shoulder to get a better look. "What does it say?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Jake began to read aloud, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the cave. The journal detailed the daily life of the lighthouse keeper, a man named Elias Blackwood, who had lived in Briarcliff during the late 1700s. The entries started innocuously enough, describing the routine maintenance of the lighthouse, the passing ships, and the changing weather. But as Jake read on, the tone of the journal grew darker, more ominous. "It says here that Blackwood discovered something hidden beneath the lighthouse," Jake continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He mentions a cave, just like this one, and something about a curse. The writing gets more frantic as it goes on." Megan felt a shiver run down her spine. The idea of a curse seemed far-fetched, but there was something about the way Jake read the words, something in the air of the cave itself, that made her uneasy. Tom, who had been listening quietly, suddenly tensed. "We need to get out of here," he said sharply. "Now." But before they could move, the ground beneath them rumbled, and a deafening crack echoed through the old cave. Rocks and debris began to fall from the ceiling, crashing down around them with terrifying force. The entrance to the cave, their only way out, was quickly obscured by a cascade of stone and earth. "Jake, Megan, get down!" Tom shouted, pulling them both to the ground as a large boulder crashed where they had just been standing. The collapse was over in seconds, but when the dust settled, the entrance was completely blocked. The cave was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from their flashlights, which flickered weakly in the thick, dust-filled air. "We're trapped," Megan whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The realization hit her like a cold wave, and for a moment panic threatened to overwhelm her. Jake, still clutching the journal, forced himself to stay calm. "It's okay. We'll find another way out," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He knew they were in a dire situation, but he couldn't let fear take over. Not now. Tom, ever the pragmatist, took charge. "Stay close to the walls," he instructed, moving toward the pile of rocks that had once been the entrance. He began to examine the blockage, feeling for any gaps or weaknesses. "There might be another exit, a smaller tunnel we can use. We just need to stay calm and think this through." As Tom worked, Jake and Megan began to explore the rest of the cave, searching for any clues that might lead them to safety. The journal in Jake's hands felt heavier than ever, as if it held not just words but the weight of the past pressing down on them. Megan's flashlight flickered over something. In the corner of the cave, another small chest, hidden beneath a layer of dust and debris. She knelt down and carefully pried it open, revealing a collection of old maps, letters, and drawings. Among them was a detailed sketch of the lighthouse, with markings that suggested the presence of hidden tunnels leading to the sea. "Jake, look at this," Megan called, holding up the sketch. "There might be a tunnel that leads out of here." Jake's heart leaped with hope as he studied the sketch. "This could be our way out," he said, his voice rising with excitement. "If we can find the entrance to the tunnel, we might just make it out of here." But as they began to search for the hidden tunnel, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of his vision, and the air grew colder, more oppressive. The journal's words echoed in his mind, a curse, and he wondered if they had uncovered something that should have remained hidden. The sound of the ocean, once a comforting presence, now felt like a looming threat, a reminder that time was running out. They had to find the tunnel, and fast, before the cave collapsed further, or the rising tides sealed their fate. As they continued their search, the journal in Jake's hands seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its pages filled with secrets that might hold the key to their survival, or their doom. The air in the cave had grown thick, heavy with dust and the lingering scent of salt water. The only light came from a small crack in the wall, where a few rays of daylight managed to filter through the piled rocks, casting an eerie glow across the damp stone. The atmosphere was tense, as if the very walls were closing in on them, and the sound of the ocean outside seemed distant and muffled, like a heartbeat fading away. Jake and Megan sat close together on the cold floor of the cave, their flashlights aimed at the journal that lay open between them. Tom was still working to clear the blocked entrance, but his efforts were slow, and the fear of being trapped forever gnawed at the edges of their minds. "Keep reading," Megan urged softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel the weight of the journal's secrets pressing down on them, as if the past itself were alive in the cave, demanding to be heard. Jake took a deep breath, steadying his trembling hands before he continued. The journal's pages were fragile, the ink faded in places, but the story it told was clear and deeply unsettling. Elias Blackwood, the lighthouse keeper, had indeed discovered the treasure of Captain Blackwell. But it wasn't as simple as finding a chest of gold and jewels. According to the journal, Blackwood had struck a deal with the pirate captain, agreeing to hide the treasure in exchange for his life. Blackwell, known for his ruthlessness, had agreed, but with a caveat: the treasure would be cursed, ensuring that anyone who sought to claim it would meet a tragic end. Blackwood, desperate and afraid, had agreed to the terms, believing that he could outsmart the curse. He hid the treasure deep within the cliffs, inside the very cave where Jake, Megan, and Tom now found themselves. But the curse was real, and it began to take its toll. The journal detailed how, after hiding the treasure, Blackwood's life began to unravel. His family fell ill, his wife drowned mysteriously near the cliffs, and his children vanished without a trace. In his final, frantic entries, Blackwood wrote of strange sounds at night, shadows that moved on their own, and a growing sense of dread that haunted him until his death. Megan shuddered as she listened, her imagination painting vivid pictures of the horrors Blackwood had endured. "He was trying to protect himself," she murmured, almost to herself. "But the curse, it's like it consumed him, piece by piece." Jake nodded grimly, his eyes locked on the journal. "And it didn't end with him," he said, flipping to the last few pages. The handwriting was erratic, the letters slanting wildly across the paper, as if Blackwood had been in a state of panic when he wrote them. He believed the curse would follow his descendants, that the bloodline itself was tainted by the deal he made. Megan's heart skipped a beat as she remembered something Tom had mentioned earlier, that his family had lived in Briarcliff for generations, long enough to be connected to the town's oldest secrets. "Jake," she said, her voice shaking, what if Tom's family is connected to this? What if he's one of Blackwood's descendants?" Jake's eyes widened at the realization. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was terrifying. "It would explain why he's always been so wary of the legends," Jake said slowly. "Maybe he's known, or at least suspected, that his family was somehow tied to this curse." Megan glanced over at Tom, who was still working tirelessly to clear the rocks. He was the only reason they hadn't completely given in to despair, his steady determination a lifeline in the darkness. But now, knowing what they did, she felt a surge of fear for him, for all of them. "We have to get out of here," Megan said urgently, her voice rising. "If the curse is real and it's still active, then staying here could—" A sudden sharp crack echoed through the cave, cutting her off. The sound was followed by a low groaning, as if the earth itself were shifting beneath them. Tom froze, turning to face them with wide, alarmed eyes. "That didn't sound good," he said, his voice tight with worry. "We need to move. Now." Jake hurriedly gathered the journal and the sketch of the tunnel they had found earlier. "We think there's another way out," he said quickly, showing Tom the sketch. "A tunnel that leads to the sea. It's our best chance." Tom nodded, not wasting any time with questions. "Lead the way," he said, grabbing his flashlight and standing at the ready. Megan took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. They moved quickly, following the sketch's directions as best they could in the dim light. The cave seemed to twist and turn in on itself, the walls closing in as the tension mounted. Every sound, a drip of water, the creak of stone, felt like an omen, a reminder that the curse was not just a story, but something real and deadly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they found it. A narrow opening in the far wall of the cave, partially hidden by a pile of debris. The tunnel was small, barely wide enough for them to crawl through, but it offered a glimmer of hope. "This has to be it," Jake said, peering into the darkness beyond. The tunnel sloped downward, the air inside thick and damp, but he could hear the faint sound of waves crashing somewhere ahead. Tom went first, squeezing into the tunnel with practiced ease. Megan followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest as she crawled through the narrow space. Jake came last, clutching the journal tightly as he moved. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in tighter the further they went. But finally, the ground began to level out, and the tunnel widened just enough for them to stand. At the end of the tunnel, they emerged onto a narrow, rocky ledge that overlooked the sea. The ocean stretched out before them, wild and untamed. But the sight of it was a welcome relief after the claustrophobic darkness of the cave. "We made it," Megan breathed, a wave of relief washing over her. But even as they stood there, catching their breath, the journal's final words echoed in Jake's mind. A warning that the curse would follow anyone who sought the treasure, bringing misfortune and death to all who tried to claim it. They had escaped the cave, but the truth of the curse still hung over them, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. The treasure was more than just gold and jewels. It was a legacy of greed, betrayal, and suffering, one that had claimed countless lives and would continue to do so unless someone broke the cycle. As they stood on that ledge, battered by the wind and the sea, Jake, Megan, and Tom knew that their journey was far from over. The curse of Captain Blackwell was real, and if they didn't find a way to stop it, they would become its next victims. The wind had picked up, howling across the cliffs with a ferocity that sent waves crashing against the rocks below, their icy spray reaching up as if trying to pull the cliffs themselves into the sea. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, churning ominously as a storm began to brew over the ocean. The sky, once clear, now swirled with shades of gray and black, and the air was thick with the smell of rain and impending danger. Jake, Megan, and Tom stood on the narrow ledge outside the cave, their eyes fixed on the brewing storm. The relief they had felt upon escaping the cave was short-lived, replaced now by a growing sense of urgency. The journal's final warning echoed in their minds. The curse wasn't just a story, and the storm was more than just a coincidence. It was as if the curse was alive, determined to claim them as its next victims. "We need to move now," Tom said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "This storm is coming in fast, and if we don't get out of here, we'll be trapped again." Megan nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "But how? The way we came in is blocked, and the cliffs are too dangerous to climb in this weather." Jake glanced back at the tunnel they had just emerged from, the narrow passage that had led them to the ledge. The cave was their only shelter, but it was also a trap. If the storm hit full force, the rising tide could flood the cave, cutting off their only escape route. They had to find another way out. "Maybe we can clear the blockage," Jake suggested, his mind racing as he tried to think of a plan. "If we can move the rocks, we can get back into the main part of the cave and climb up to the lighthouse." Tom didn't waste time arguing. He knew their options were limited, and time was running out. "It's our best shot," he agreed. "Let's go." They hurried back into the tunnel, the walls shaking as the storm drew nearer. The wind howled through the narrow space, creating an eerie, whistling sound that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The ground beneath their feet was slick with moisture, and the air was thick with the taste of salt. When they reached the blockage, a wall of rocks and debris that had sealed off the cave's entrance, they could see that the situation was worse than they had imagined. The rocks were heavy, some the size of boulders, and the debris was packed tightly, as if the cave itself was conspiring to keep them inside. "Okay, let's do this," Jake said, rolling up his sleeves and grabbing the nearest rock. His hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the fear that they might not make it out in time. Megan joined him, using all her strength to push against the rocks. Her fingers were raw from the rough stone, but she didn't let that stop her. She thought of the curse, of the countless lives it had claimed, and of the people she loved. She wasn't going to let it take them too. Tom, the strongest of the three, took the lead, using his weight and leverage to shift the larger boulders. His muscles strained with the effort, and beads of sweat mixed with the rain that had begun to seep into the cave. The storm was getting closer, and the sound of the ocean was growing louder, more insistent. The minutes dragged on as they worked, each second feeling like an eternity. The cave rumbled ominously, as if it could collapse at any moment, and the wind outside was now a deafening roar. But they didn't stop, didn't give in to the exhaustion that gnawed at their limbs. Finally, with a loud groan, one of the larger rocks shifted, creating a small gap in the blockage. It wasn't much, but it was enough for them to squeeze through. "Go, go!" Tom urged, waving Jake and Megan forward. Jake pushed through the gap first, his body scraping against the rough edges of the rocks. He winced as the jagged stones tore at his clothes and skin, but he didn't slow down. On the other side, he found himself back in the main chamber of the cave, the sound of the storm even louder now. Megan followed, her smaller frame making it easier for her to slip through the gap. She landed next to Jake, breathing heavily, but relieved to be out of the tunnel. Tom came last, his broad shoulders making it difficult for him to squeeze through. But with a final push, he managed to force his way out, just as the first drops of rain began to fall through the crack in the cave's ceiling. "Now what?" Megan asked, her voice trembling as she looked up at the ceiling, which was starting to leak more water with each passing second. "The lighthouse," Jake said, pointing to a narrow path that led upward, winding its way through the cave and toward the surface. "If we can get to the lighthouse, we might be able to find shelter until the storm passes." They didn't need to be told twice. With the storm raging outside and the cave threatening to flood, they knew they had no time to waste. The climb was treacherous, the path narrow and slippery from the rain. The wind howled through the cave, whipping their clothes and stinging their faces with cold, sharp droplets. The rocks beneath their feet were loose and unstable, threatening to give way at any moment. But they pushed on, driven by a desperate need to survive. Jake led the way, his flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. Megan followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest, while Tom brought up the rear, his strong hands helping to steady them when the path became too difficult. As they climbed higher, the cave began to rumble again, a deep, ominous sound that made the ground shake beneath them. Water was pouring in from above, and the walls were slick with moisture. The storm was in full force now, the sound of the ocean a constant roar that drowned out all other noise. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the top of the path. The cave opened up into a small chamber, with a narrow, jagged opening that led out onto the cliffs. The lighthouse was just visible in the distance, its beam of light cutting through the stormy night like a beacon of hope. But their relief was short-lived. As they emerged onto the cliffs, they were met with the full force of the storm. The wind was so strong that it nearly knocked them off their feet, and the rain lashed at them with a fury that left their skin raw and burning. "We have to get to the lighthouse!" Jake shouted over the wind, his voice barely audible. Megan nodded, her face pale and determined. "Let's go!" They started to run, their feet slipping on the wet rocks, the wind pushing against them with every step. The lighthouse seemed impossibly far away, the distance stretching out before them like a cruel joke. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. Just as they reached the final stretch of the cliffs, a massive wave crashed against the rocks below, sending a wall of water surging toward them. Jake grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her back just in time as the water slammed into the cliffs, soaking them to the bone and nearly sweeping them off their feet. "Tom!" Megan screamed, her voice filled with terror as she looked back. Tom was struggling to keep his footing, the wind and rain battering him from all sides. But he was close, so close, and with a final, desperate effort, he managed to reach them. Together they made the last push to the lighthouse, their bodies exhausted, their minds numb with fear and adrenaline. The storm raged around them, but the lighthouse stood strong, its light guiding them forward. They reached the door and threw it open, stumbling inside just as another wave crashed against the cliffs, sending a spray of water through the open doorway. Tom slammed the door shut behind them, and for a moment they just stood there, breathing heavily, the sound of the storm muffled by the thick walls. "We made it!" Jake gasped, his body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Megan collapsed onto the floor, her entire body trembling. "We're safe! We're safe!" Tom leaned against the door, his face pale but resolute. "For now," he said, his voice grim. "But we're not out of danger yet. The storm's not over, and neither is the curse." Jake nodded, his mind already racing with what they needed to do next. The journal's warning had been clear. The curse wouldn't stop until it had claimed what it was owed. They had escaped the cave, but the storm was still raging, and the curse was still very much alive. But for now, they were safe. And as the lighthouse's beam cut through the darkness, they knew they had a fighting chance. They had faced the curse and survived, and as they huddled together in the warmth of the lighthouse, they vowed to break the curse once and for all, no matter what it took. The wind howled outside the lighthouse, its mournful cry echoing through the tower like a warning. Inside, the walls offered some protection from the storm, but the tension was palpable. Jake, Megan, and Tom huddled together in the small circular room at the base of the lighthouse, the flickering light from an old oil lamp casting long shadows across their weary faces. They had escaped the cave in the immediate danger of the storm, but the knowledge of the curse weighed heavily on them. The journal's final entries had made it clear the curse would not rest until it had taken its due, and they knew deep down that simply surviving the storm was not enough to free them from the curse's grasp. "We can't just wait here," Jake said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "The curse won't stop until it's finished what it started." Megan looked up from where she sat on the floor, the journal open on her lap. She had been reading through the last few pages again, hoping to find some clue they had missed. "There has to be a way to break it," she murmured. "Something Blackwood didn't see. Something we can do." Tom, who had been pacing near the door, stopped and turned to face them. "If this curse is real, and I'm starting to believe it is, then it's tied to the treasure, right? To Blackwood's betrayal. Maybe the only way to end it is to undo what he did." Jake frowned, considering Tom's words. "You mean return the treasure? Give it back to the sea?" Tom nodded. "It's worth a shot. If Blackwood hid the treasure to keep it for himself, maybe putting it back where it belongs will break the curse. But we don't have much time. The storm is still raging, and who knows how long we have before something else happens." Megan closed the journal, her decision made. "Then we need to find the treasure and return it. That's the only way." The three of them knew what they had to do, but the challenge was daunting. They had no idea where exactly the treasure was hidden, only that it was somewhere within the cliffs or the cave. The journal had provided clues, but the details were vague, obscured by Blackwood's growing madness. "We have to go back to the cave," Jake said, his voice firm. "It's the only place left to search." Tom's face hardened with determination. "Then let's do it. The longer we wait, the stronger the curse will get." They gathered what little supplies they had, a length of rope, the oil lamp, and a few tools Tom had brought along. The storm had begun to ease slightly, but the wind was still strong, and the rain fell in sheets as they stepped back outside. The lighthouse's beam cut through the darkness, guiding them as they made their way back down the path to the cliffs. The descent was treacherous, the ground slippery and unstable from the rain, but they moved quickly, driven by the knowledge that their time was running out. As they approached the cave, the waves crashed against the rocks with renewed force, sending sprays of icy water over them. When they reached the entrance, Jake hesitated for a moment, glancing at Megan and Tom. "Are you both sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Megan nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We have to finish this, Jake. We can't live in fear of the curse." Tom didn't say anything, but his expression said it all. He was ready. Together they entered the cave once more, the darkness swallowing them whole. The air was thick with moisture, and the sound of the ocean echoed through the narrow passage, a constant reminder of the danger that lay ahead. They retraced their steps, moving deeper into the cave until they reached the chamber where they had first discovered the journal. The debris from the earlier collapse had settled, but the air was still heavy with dust and the lingering scent of salt water. Where would he have hidden it? Megan wondered aloud, her voice echoing off the stone walls. It has to be close. Jake knelt down beside the old chest they had found earlier, his fingers brushing over the decayed wood. Blackwood mentioned hiding the treasure in a place where no one would find it. Somewhere protected. Tom scanned the chamber, his eyes narrowing as he noticed something unusual. "Over there," he said, pointing to a section of the wall that seemed different from the rest. "That part of the wall, it looks like it's been disturbed." They moved quickly to the wall, using their tools to pry away the loose stones. As they worked, the sound of the storm outside seemed to grow louder, as if the very elements were urging them to hurry. Finally, with a grunt of effort, Tom dislodged a large stone, revealing a small, hidden alcove behind it. Inside the alcove was a chest, smaller than the one they had found earlier, but clearly ancient. The wood was dark and cracked, the metal bindings tarnished with age. It was unmistakably the treasure of Captain Blackwell. Jake carefully pulled the chest from its hiding place, the weight of it surprising him. He set it down on the ground, and they all stared at it, the reality of what they had found sinking in. "This is it," Jake said, his voice hushed. "The treasure." Megan's hands shook as she reached out to touch the chest. "It feels wrong," she whispered. "Like it's alive, like it's watching us." Tom didn't hesitate. "Then let's get rid of it," he said, his voice firm. "We need to return it to the sea, just like Blackwood should have done." With great effort, they carried the chest back through the cave and out onto the cliffs. The storm had intensified again, the wind whipping around them with a force that made it difficult to stand. But they pressed on, their determination unwavering. When they reached the edge of the cliffs, they paused, the chest balanced precariously between them. The ocean below was a seething mass of dark water, the waves crashing violently against the rocks. "This is it," Jake said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "This is where we end it." With one final push, they heaved the chest over the edge of the cliff. It fell, tumbling through the air before disappearing into the churning waters below. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the world holding its breath. Then, as the chest vanished beneath the waves, the storm began to ease. The wind died down, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and the clouds began to part, revealing a sliver of moonlight that shone down on the cliffs. Jake, Megan, and Tom stood in silence, watching as the ocean gradually calmed. The curse, it seemed, had been lifted. "We did it!" Megan whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. "We really did it!" Tom placed a hand on her shoulder, his face softening for the first time in hours. "It's over," he said quietly. "The curse is broken." Jake nodded, his eyes still fixed on the ocean. "Blackwood's story ends here," he said, "but we've given it a new ending, one that doesn't involve fear and death." The three of them stood together on the cliffs, the weight of the curse finally lifted from their shoulders. The lighthouse's beams swept over the ocean, a symbol of hope and safety, guiding them back to the lives they had almost lost. As they made their way back to the lighthouse, the storm clouds finally broke, revealing a sky full of stars. The wind was gentle now, the air cool and clean, as if the world itself had been cleansed. They returned to the lighthouse, exhausted but victorious. Inside, the warmth and light welcomed them, a stark contrast to the darkness they had just escaped. For the first time since their adventure began, they felt at peace. The treasure was gone, the curse was broken, and they were safe. The town of Briarcliff would no longer be haunted by the legacy of Captain Blackwell, and the lighthouse, once a symbol of danger, now stood as a beacon of hope. As they sat together, sharing the relief of their survival, Jake picked up the journal one last time. He didn't need to read it anymore. They had written the final chapter with their actions. But he knew that the story of Elias Blackwood and the curse that had plagued his family would be one he would never forget.